So with that, we're now going to hand over to Steve. Steve published the Contact Babel report yesterday. All of you will get a free copy of that at the end of the presentation. And Steve's going to kind of look at this at more of an industry-wide level, and we're going to see what trends come out. So with that, Steve, I'm going to hand over to you.
Okay, thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. Let's see if we can get this working. Contact Babel carries out large-scale research into the contact center industry, and for the first time, we're looking specifically at customer experience. I'd like to show some insights from one of our most recent reports, which came out last week. Yep, so got about 15 minutes here on what customers want versus what businesses think customers want. So we ran two side-by-side surveys, one for 246 UK businesses and the other for 1,000 UK customers. Some of the questions in the survey were asked both to businesses and customers. Right, so the report itself looks at all elements of customer experience, including things like budgets, investment, use and effect of technology, what customer experience really means to customers. We've got some information there on things like benchmarking and measurement techniques and also scores. And one of the interesting things that we're going to look at today is how ready businesses and customers are to move away from the traditional agent-based model of customer service and into pure automation. So let's look at the findings from three particular questions. So the first thing, what are the top three most important factors to you when contacting an organization? So really, what does a good customer experience actually look like? So first, let's have a look at what businesses think. This is a question that we've been asking to businesses for many, many years. And as time's gone on, one factor above all has grown in importance so much that there's virtually no competition anymore. So you can see that at the bottom of the screen there, first contact resolution. Now that's seen by businesses as being the key to successful customer experience. So you can see 87% of businesses surveyed put this in their top three most important things. And there's nothing, of those factors there, nothing is filler. They're all important. Short call or web chat times, you can see there, that used to be one of the most important things you could possibly measure, the call duration. Now, businesses don't believe that's terribly important to customer experience. It's about getting the issue resolved first time. Short queue times, also very important. This is absolutely key to customer satisfaction. We've seen in many pieces of research over the years. And not unreasonably, generally being polite and friendly also being seen as important to the customer experience, but it's the first contact resolution that really stands out there. Interestingly, having UK-based employees was seen by businesses as being almost irrelevant to superior customer experience. And we'll see if that's actually true in the next slide. So for the customer experience report, we put the same question to our 1,000 customer panel. And in line with what the business believed, first contact resolution came out again as the #1 choice. Not as obviously as businesses believe, but yes, you can still see there, this is what people think. #1, the question or issue is solved first time. This is especially the case with the older demographics there. And it's certainly true as well, pretty unsurprisingly, that customers value short queues almost as much as first contact resolution. They value short queues much more important, and they value short call or web chat time. So this aligns with what the businesses think. So that's great. We're heading in the right direction. One thing that really stood out when you compare the two side by side is that despite what businesses believe, it's interesting to note that almost as many customers state that having UK-based agents is as important to their customer experience as first contact resolution. And as you can see, again, this is especially the case, much more so with the older generations, the over 55s, and much less important for millennials. The millennial set of customers, they value their time. Of course, everybody values their time, but the millennials, especially do so. So they say things like short queue times and 24/7 availability were much more important to them than perhaps they are to the older generation. So looking at the second question, would you prefer to speak with an agent or use automation if the effort, time and outcome were identical? I mean, this is quite an unrealistic question. So what we were trying to do in real life, what we're trying to do is get a feeling for just how amenable people were to use automation. If it's trying to level in the playing field between automation and human. We asked those organisations surveyed for this report what they thought their customers would prefer. Those in B2C businesses tended to believe that their customer base would prefer to speak to a person, whereas those in business to business organisations had a more balanced view. So obviously, because we're asking customers here, these are all about B2C environments. So again, this is pretty closely aligned. Businesses were right. Most people would prefer to speak to an employee, even if the automation did exactly as good a job and took the exact amount of time. And then we did expect, when you're writing these questions, we kind of think, well, I know what's going to come out of this, but I have to ask just so I can, prove it. And this has gone a bit of a surprise for me because we expected there to be quite a significant difference between age groups. We would have thought that the youngest age group would be keener than any to use automation rather than speak to an agent. Although there is certainly a pattern. For example, if you look at the over 65s, they're far more likely to want to speak to an employee. It's the 25 to 34-year-old age group that gives automation the greatest chance. I mean, that's you've got a good number of proportion there, 34% that would prefer to use automation rather than talk to somebody, and that's far higher than anything else. And if you look, the 16 to 24-year-olds kind of muddy the waters a bit because they actually state that they prefer to speak to an employee rather than use automation, which you wouldn't have thought was going to be the case. Although this is just conjecture, it may be the case that this younger stage group is as yet relatively inexperienced in speaking with businesses, because some of the answers to the other questions that we asked were, well, shall I say, a little bit eccentric as well. So as a move on to the third question, please. Thank you. So this was a deeper question. What would be your preferred method for contacting a company? Not necessarily what you actually end up doing in real life, but what would you prefer to do? And this was asked in 3 instances, high emotion, high urgency, and high complexity instances. So with the rapid expansion in digital channels, it can be difficult for businesses to understand which channels customers actually want to be using. And this will obviously impact on things like resourcing and skills as well going forward. So we've been tracking the UK contact centre market for 15 years now. And since 2006, we've been asking contact centres about what their inbound channel mix looks like in terms of proportion of interactions by various channels. And you can see when we started this research, telephony accounted for pretty much 90% of interactions. And that figure's declined over the years pretty consistently to about 66% today. And we would expect it by the end of 2021 to be around the low 60 marks. Perhaps the biggest difference, apart from this relative decline, I should say, in telephony, is the growth in email from 5% perhaps in 2006 to almost 20% today. And it is also worth noting that for kind of all the excitement and focus and investment that we've seen around social media as a customer service channel, it actually accounts for very few interactions in the in the great scheme of things. And it's also definitely worth noting that web chat has seen very significant growth in the last few years, and this is something which we are very bullish about in the future. So moving to the next slide. Because a lot of the companies that take part in our surveys each year are necessarily different from year to year, we get different companies taking part. It's important to find out whether any annual percentage changes in channels is actually due to real structural changes within the industry, or simply just because we're asking different businesses what they experience. And So what we do here is we ask the question, how has your business changed? And then hopefully we can match that up and get an idea about, what's really happening in the industry. So we can see here that digital channels such as web chat and social media are expected to grow strongly in the next 12 months, as you would expect. But perhaps the most important finding here is that live telephony is expected to decrease by 48% of operations over the next 12 months, which is in line with the finding that we saw in the previous slide about telephony's slow relative decline. Moving on to the customer interaction cube. This is a simple schematic that we put together to visualize the various types of customer interactions in the form of a 2x2x2 matrix. Each interaction that a customer has with a business will have various levels of complexity, emotional input from the side of the customer, and also urgency. And it was our hypothesis that the same customer would have very different preferences depending on the mix of each of these variables in a particular interaction. Next slide. Before we carried out the research, we wanted to identify 3 scenarios to ask to customers that the vast majority of UK customers will have either experienced or can at least imagine. So one with high emotional importance, one with great urgency, and one with a high level of complexity. So as the high emotion scenario, we chose the example of a customer returning an incorrect item that was sent to them by a retailer. So the customer orders the wrong item, so it's frustrating not to get, the customer's delivered the wrong item, so it's frustrating not to get something that they were looking forward to. And they've also got the problem that they then have to figure out how to get the item back to the retailer, even though it really shouldn't be the customer's problem. In these circumstances, we believe that email would be the primary channel for a large proportion of customers, as it's often used for complaints. It doesn't require a great deal of effort or any actual wait time on behalf of the customer. It's simply a fire and forget interaction. We thought that the phone would be a secondary channel for those customers who simply want to deal with the situation there and then and not wait around. In the high urgency example, the second one, we chose a scenario where customers asked to imagine they're picking somebody up at an airport and they need to check the flight arrival time. It probably isn't necessarily a high emotional importance, and it's certainly a pretty simple request, so it scores low on complexity. So we had a strong feeling that this would tend to be handled by web-based self-service, some sort of automated service, but with some customers again preferring to use the phone for whatever reason. And finally, for a high complexity scenario, we asked customers to imagine they were having difficulty completing a mortgage form, a mortgage application form. So we asked them to consider how they go about getting help. And we believed that rather than wading through a potentially very high number of complicated jargon-riddled web pages, they might prefer to speak to someone in real time, so either by phone or possibly by web chat. So let's have a look at what people actually said. So looking at the high emotion type of interaction, so that's the returning the item that was wrongly delivered. When we actually carried out the research, we found that our hypothesis was pretty much true. That email was the #1 choice, with a significant proportion of people alternatively wanting to phone the contact centre. That fitted in nicely with what we thought. And it's interesting to see the difference between age groups. The oldest age group, so 65 plus, we're just as likely to use the phone as use email, whereas the 2 youngest age groups, those under 34, were much more likely to use email first or try web chat rather than picking up the phone. Earlier in the presentation, I mentioned that social media gets more airtime than perhaps it currently deserves. And it's notable here that only a few of the very youngest age group would really choose this channel as a primary option. So social media is there in green. You can see 7% of the youngest age group, and after that it gets pretty negligible. I mean, this is the primary channel though, so having said that, it's more than likely that if people don't get anywhere with a phone or an email, then the social media channel will then be used to vent their frustrations to the world. So we obviously still need to keep an eye on that. So that's high emotion. Let's look now at high urgency. So that's we're picking somebody up from the airport. Now, our pretty obvious hypothesis was that people would prefer to use web self-service or an app, something like that, and this is to a great extent true. This channel is by far the most popular choice amongst our respondents, regardless of the age. But we should note, even here, half of respondents chose an alternative channel. I mean, we've got 1 in 5. I talked earlier about the youngest age group and their rather interesting take on how to communicate with a business. We've got 1 in 5 16 to 24-year-olds actually choose email, which does seem like a bizarre choice, really. Another example, perhaps, of their relative lack of experience of dealing with businesses. And again, the older generations, you can see, they're far more likely than the youngest to pick up the phone. I'm moving on to our third option, the high complexity, our mortgage application form. The picture is muddled, to say the least. Our hypothesis that phone and web chat will be the key channels actually seems incorrect here, as a very significant proportion of the older generations will take the time to visit a bank branch, and there was real spread elsewhere with websites, email, web chat, telephony. They've all got their fans. And a significant number of survey proportions, especially amongst the oldest generation, admitted they'd have no idea what they do. So this kind of throws up more questions than answers, really. It's worth noting that millennials are more likely to use supported or agent-assisted digital channels. So that's email, social, web chat, whereas the older generation are more likely to choose actual face-to-face or traditional telephony, actually physically using their voice to talk to a person. So that's one difference that we can take away from this slide. So looking at the conclusions to this report presentation, there's some quite interesting conclusions to be drawn. Everybody values getting their issue resolved first time. That's something we've been saying for years and years is key to customer success and also to managing the costs of the contact center. It is the older generations that really want this the most, though. They are also very keen to talk to UK agents, but they don't want to have to queue in order to do so, which is obviously an issue. Millennials value their time just as much, but in a somewhat different way to the older generation. They place more importance on having 24/7 availability. They're more likely to try agent-assisted digital channels rather than traditional telephony. And they're generally more willing to give automation a try, although even these guys, they're not still entirely sold upon it. And, just to labour the point, there's some quite strange findings coming from the youngest demographic, which could theoretically be because they haven't had a great deal of experience talking to businesses and they're still finding their way. Cynics might suggest that businesses could see them as being malleable and possibly even trainable, and encourage them to use the channels that suit the business. So how does this, what we've talked about here, translate into actually delivering superior customer experience? Well, in conjunction with looking at the demographics of your customer base, the customer interaction cube, the 2x2x2 matrix, can be used to determine how many of each type of contact you receive and what your customers of today and tomorrow are likely to want to use, which can obviously help with resourcing and training as well as customer experience. While increasing levels of automation, that's almost certainly an important part of any customer contact mix in the future. It is important to see that the customer of today, regardless of their age, will only choose to use self-service if it suits them. And that the majority of time, they want the reassurance and confidence that comes with communicating with an agent. Now, whether that's through live telephony or whether it's through the agent-assisted digital support, the email, web chat, social media, the importance of the agent isn't going to go away at any time in the near future. And perhaps the most important thing to note is that there's very little in the way of unanimous responses. For whatever reason, different customers will choose different channels, even if they don't seem, from somebody else's perspective, to be particularly well suited to what they're trying to achieve. And if that channel can't deliver what the customer wants, then a seamless recovery route is needed. And this will almost certainly involve an agent who understands the context and history of what the customers have been trying to do in order to rescue the situation. So, we're coming back, we haven't mentioned the word, but omni-channel, there we are. And finally, finally. Next slide, please. Oh, yes, there we are. Quick plug for Contact Babel. Most of this stuff is free. This presentation is based on our latest report, the UK Customer Experience Decision Makers Guide. So it's the first time we've dipped our toe in customer experience rather than contact centres. I hope you enjoy it. If you visit the website, you'll find a lot of primary research-based reports on all elements of customer experience and the contact centre industry, the vast majority of which are free to download. Thank you very much for listening, and we're very happy to take your questions later.
Well, thanks very much for that, Steve. That was really insightful. I think there were some real kind of key things that stood out, not least the consistency between the business and customer perceptions around first call resolution being the primary objective. And I think in this age where everyone is so sort of time poor, that's possibly not a surprise. Also, the piece that stood out was around the short wait time that people's kind of, I guess, impatience because of this value that people place on their time, that they're not really willing to spend an awful lot of time sat in a queue circling above the airport waiting to land on a contact center agent. And I think one of the real quick wins that we see many of the customers that we deal with using is just that flipping that switch to use the call me back option. So when the business sees that the wait time has gone beyond a certain threshold, 2 minutes, 3 minutes, 5 minutes, whatever they want to set it at, giving the customer the option just to say, fine, call me back because I'm not going to sit in the queue for more than 3 or 4 minutes, is a good way of preserving that kind of brand and that goodwill of the customer. Also interesting to see that voice is still clearly the #1 channel pretty much across all demographics. I think one of the things that is changing as we sort of look at the different channels and technologies and ways that customers can communicate. So as we looked at the high emotion, high urgency, high complexity scenarios on the different primary communication channel there, voice is still sort of ever present within that mix. But I think, again, when we looked at the Lego story, it's what voice, and it's not necessarily a generic call center agent that is the voice. Increasingly, we see people, this concept of the connected enterprise, people that work in middle and back office functions who may not consider themselves a customer service representative or agent, but they are now in some way, shape or form involved in dealing with and communicating with the customer. And I certainly see in many of the customers that we deal with that are using Microsoft-based UC like Skype and Teams, that's definitely a trend that we see where people in the mid and back office are now folded in to the customer experience.